when Helmut asked me, I thought I'm going to use this occasion to think through the extensive continuum. So it's something which, since I did my PhD, has fascinated me, but I think I've never got to the bottom of it. I'll tell you, I still haven't got to the bottom of it, but I have used this. All I'm going to do is try and work out and tell you what I think it means. But then I'm really worried again, because I don't know if you feel like this. When you're at a Whitehead conference, you think, well, I'm just going to say what I think Whitehead says, but you all know what Whitehead says, because that's why you're here. You've read Process and Reality, so I'm probably just going to be saying things which you know already. If I am, I apologize, but I got very surprised when I was rereading this chapter. Anyway, the chapter on the extensive continuum is quite a read. Whitehead sets out all the major concerns of his philosophy of organism, and he does so in a really quick, almost breathless manner. He provides page-length quotes from Newton and Descartes, really long quotes. There's a lengthy commentary of Zeno's paradox. It's Whitehead at his most philosophical, in the sense of engaging with the most metaphysical of questions, but also at his most scientific, because he discusses specific concepts such as the physical field. And he means the physical field in physics, as thought of in the early 20th century. But Whitehead's discussion of the extensive continuum is also very sparse, and for good reason. Because when he talks of extensiveness, he has gone beyond usual conceptions of extension, certainly in terms of space and time. Extension is not about space and time in extensive continuum at the start. Time and space are special and limited cases of a more general sense of extensiveness. Now, it's difficult to think of extensiveness which is prior to space and time. And I've put a footnote in that line, and I've done that over prior, because I said prior to space and time. But prior itself is a word which has connotations, temporal connotations. So I don't want to say prior to space and time, but I hope you get the idea. Is that better, Melanie? Okay, all right, good. The difficulty for the reader, rather than for Whitehead, is in the fact that Whitehead can never just describe the mere continuum. We also need to think about the standpoint or perspective from which the continuum is objectified by a subject. This is because Whitehead takes both relativity and perception very seriously indeed. I sometimes think, when people do talks, they wait till the end to give the exciting bit. So I'm not saying I've got an exciting bit, but I think what I want to argue, or one of the things I want to discuss, is you could say that the extensive continuum does not exist. It's real, but it doesn't exist, because it's not actual. Because existence is only those things which are actual, and yet it's real. But how can we have things which are real and things which are actual? Well, we do, because Whitehead asks us to think two things at once. Anyway, maybe. But as Lennart said, because you looked at the file, what I called my talk, I called it 5 Things to Say. That's what, on my computer, it's called 5 Things to Say. So here are the 5 things I'm going to try and say. Character is crucial for Whitehead. It's a word he uses over 200 times in Process and Reality. If you add characterization in, you're up to nearly 400 times in Process and Reality. 2, the ontological principle only applies to actual entities or actual occasions. The principle of relativity applies only to eternal objects. You probably know this, but if you think it through, it has real implications. 3, solidarity is not about community. It is about the past, the future, and the present. 4, I don't know if I'm going to get through all this now. 4, it's eternal objects which both express and carry the character of existence. But they only do so via the body. 5, we live in a world not of actual entities, not of eternal objects, but a world of transmutation. The category of transmutation, which we never talk about. Or I never talk about. You probably all talk about it all the time. When I say we, I'm meaning me. I'm meaning my limited understanding and reading of Whitehead. Okay, you probably all do it. Sorry, I apologise. I told you I was being selfish. Right, I'm going to start with point 2, the one we all know about. That the ontological principle is concerned with actual occasions, and the principle of relativity is the realm of potentiality, and hence eternal objects. I don't think it's controversial, but just as a reminder, he says, in the chapter on the extensive continuum, the actual world is built up of actual occasions, and by the ontological principle, whatever things there are in any sense of existence are derived from actual occasions. We all know that. The principle of relativity, on the other hand, states that it belongs to the nature of a being, in inverted commas, that it is a potential for every becoming. This is the principle of relativity. Okay, that's fine. Now, while I'm doing quotations, or evidence as I call it, on page 149 of Process and Reality, I think he actually makes the point I'm trying to make when he says he wants to deny that actual entities fall within the scope of the principle of relativity. So I just think it's worth having a nice, neat, I don't normally like neat categorizations, but I think it's really worth it sticking with it and seeing where we get up to. I can now go back to character. How's my timing going? Oh, it's about right. The importance of character. He uses it about 13 times in this chapter. Other people have. You know, have you all got a searchable PDF of Process and Reality? It's brilliant. When I started all this, they were quite rare, but I think everybody's got it now. But it's great. You just go, how many times do you use character? Shh, right. Whitehead's discussion of extensive continuum starts with perception. He actually starts by mentioning presentational immediacy. I wanted to stick to this chapter, but you can't. The last chapter, the chapter before on fact and form, he ends up talking about Locke, presentational objectification, causal objectification, which are the more general forms of perception, and abstract essences, which I might come back to. Then he starts the chapter on the extensive continuum saying, now I'm going to talk about what we do with think about in terms of perception. But that's page 61. By page 62, he's gone way beyond, back to presentational objectification of the most abstract metaphysical stuff. Okay. So, Whitehead refuses to allow existence to bifurcate. We all know this. He thinks there are major metaphysical problems which arise when subjects are separated from objects. This is especially pertinent when it comes to perception. How do the things that we perceive enter into our eyes, while both the things perceived and our eyes remain what they are? In this way, the problem of perception relates to a fundamental question that Whitehead raises and tries to answer throughout Process and Reality. That is, how can one entity be in another entity? Now, there are two aspects to that question. Again, I think Whitehead's asking us to think two things at once. On the one hand, he's trying to rebut Aristotle's statement that one subject cannot be present in another. And a very quick answer is that it's the principle of relativity which enables one thing to be in another, because, he says, page 50, the principle of universal relativity directly traverses Aristotle's dictum that a subject is not present in a subject. On the contrary, according to this principle, an actual entity is present in other actual entities. He hasn't told us how, but he's just telling us that that's the role of the principle of relativity. Okay. Now, the second aspect of this question is what Whitehead refers to early on as the true philosophic question, which is sort of thinking of the same thing the other way around, which is how can concrete fact exhibit entities which are abstract from itself and yet participated in by its own nature? So how does the one thing produce something which it gives off to the next thing? And thinking about it the other way around is, how does one thing take that thing and make it into the new thing? So there are two sides to it, all at once. I haven't explained that very well, but don't worry, it's all I'm going to keep saying throughout the rest of the talk, in different ways, the same thing. Right, a quick word on relativity. In the chapter on the extensive continuum, Whitehead makes reference to Einstein's notion of relativity twice in the first 5 pages. Now, we know, and other people know much better than I, that since at least the concept of nature, Whitehead was trying to develop a philosophy which did not rely upon any notion of time at an instance, or space at an instance in terms of simple location. And this relates to one aspect of Einstein's notion of special relativity, namely the problem of measurement. There's no absolute position in space or time on which to base measurements. And such positions have to be constituted, okay? But for Whitehead, he says that the problem is wider than Einstein realizes. and it relates partly from a concept of nature into how objects partake in events. What do I mean? And how does all this relate to the extensive continuum? And what about the notion of character, which you said your talk was going to be about? These are questions you should be asking, and I'm asking myself. So I'll start with the extensive continuum. So Whitehead started the chapter on the extensive continuum with a discussion of presentational immediacy, with perception. Now, our perception of a contemporary world is of something which is not divided. We don't encounter a collection of distinct entities, but something more like a scene or a panorama. I'm seeing one thing. Whitehead says that this means we perceive the contemporary world as a continuum, and he defines a continuum as something which is continuous. And by continuous, he just means that it's not divided. That's it. Okay? However, a continuum is divisible. It could be divided. I'll try and give a little example. I mean, I am currently seeing a big room, but I can start dividing it up. I go, well, there's an upstairs, there's a downstairs, and then I can divide it up into tables, and then I can divide it up into people. There are lots of ways that I could do it, or I could divide the room to how it was 10 seconds ago. It offers potential for division. But more than that, remember the ontological principle. That's the principle of relativity, sort of. But remember the ontological principle. The world is, in fact, or in its actuality, divided and atomic, being a multiplicity of definite actual entities. That's on the same page. Again, we have to think two things at once, and I mean this quite seriously. We might not be able to do it, but we should try. In this instance, the two things are actuality as divided, as comprised by actual occasions, as guaranteed by the ontological principle. But concurrently, we need to think of the contemporary world as continuous, as undivided, as offering potential for division. How to reconcile these two? And here comes the technical bit. So I'll take a drink of water. One technical bit. Did I bring my water? Can anybody see a bottle? There is water here. How does perception in its most general sense operate? How can one entity be in another? Fizzy, I didn't expect that. Now, the first step is to realize that not all of a previous, sorry for the word previous, entity can be incorporated into a new entity. Some elements of the previous entity are dismissed as irrelevant. Nevertheless, in the chapter on the extensive continuum, Whitehead refers to what he calls the real component from or of the objectified entity, which functions as a datum for the novel entity. I know it sounds technical. It's just the bit, when something is starting to perceive the world, what is it that it's perceived? Because it's not the whole given world all at once. It's not the world comes into you. That would be boring. That would just be reproduction of the world into itself. Okay, but what is it? What is the original datum? This real component, and he's saying real component, cannot be actual because only actual occasions are actual. That's guaranteed by the distinction between the ontological principle and the principle of relativity. And the real component is not a simple physical incorporation of certain elements of the previous entity. Now, once an actual entity has become, its activeness is over, but it is not inert. Instead, it takes place in what Whitehead calls the community which makes up the actual world. Community is not a word that Whitehead uses very often, roughly 18 times in the whole of process reality, but he uses it 6 times in the chapter on the extensive continuum. Control F, Control F. It refers to the actual world in the past. And as has come up a couple of times this week, sometimes I think we should remember that Whitehead was a sort of sensible English philosopher. He didn't doubt that there was a world out there. He says, but he just felt that we didn't have adequate ways of explaining our relation to such an actual world and how it passes on and becomes a future world. He's quite happy with, he talks about the actual world, but he says, of course, it's relative because the terms yesterday, today, and tomorrow are relative terms, but of an actual world. I don't know when that the list went up of the people going to the jazz thing. It really disturbed my actual world because it mentioned tomorrow. but then tomorrow became today. So that was probably written yesterday about today, when today becomes yesterday. And so the actual world, it's there, it's out there, but it keeps changing. And this is, so it's not highfalutin, it is highfalutin metaphysics, but I think we need to keep a grounding. Never mind. The extensive continuum was one way in which Whitehead achieves his understanding of it. So he accepts that there is an actual world, but he does not want to say that it is simply given, simply factual. It does not, and is not a sort of physical entity which determines or causes the future. So what does he say? I'm going back to the real component. He says, the actual world, insofar as it is a community of entities which are settled, actual, and already become, conditions and limits the potentiality for creativeness beyond itself. This given world provides determinant data which the characters of its actual entities can provide. So we're talking about that, so we're now finally on to characters. But what does he mean by the characters of actual entities? It's the first hint. Right, I'm going to jump ahead. What is given is not. It's an indication of how the world was, how it became, and how this influences what can subsequently become. This takes us back to the real component. Now, do you remember I said that there needs to be a real component when an entity is starting out? Wrong word, I mean, it's awful, but when it's at its initial phases, what is the real component? And fascinatingly, the real component, and this is page 62 of the Extensive Continuum chapter, the real component is how that particular entity is a datum in the experience of the subject. And it's the extensive continuum which enables this. Here's the relevant quotation. I'm going to give you the whole quotation. Some real component in the objectified entity assumes the role of being how that particular entity is a datum in the experience of the subject. In this case, the objectified contemporaries are only directly relevant to the subject in their character of arising from a datum which is an extensive continuum. So it's simply, at the very start, it is the character of being given by an extensive continuum. But he hasn't told us what is extensive about the extensive continuum yet, because space and time come in later pages. Okay, so as I've said, one key element of this extensive continuum, in its most broadest and mathematical sense, is that it enables the possibility of perception. But as opposed to Kant, who was positing space and time as enabling perception, as some kind of pure intuition, Whitehead makes no assumptions. Even more exciting, the extensive continuum does not involve shapes, dimensions, or measurability. The only properties throughout the whole chapter that he sort of hints at and says that there are to the extensive continuum, to that which enables extensiveness, are those of, on page 66, he says, we have to allow for common parts or contact. So that's why part 4, if you read that of Process and Reality, the theory of extension, that's his main concern. How can two things meet and how can they overlap? I mean, I just love this, that he's applying all this to this. This is the basis of what might constitute extensiveness. Okay, now I'm going to interrupt myself to raise a couple of questions. It's the one I raised at the beginning. Is the extensive continuum real? Does it actually exist? It turns out that these are in fact two different questions with two very different answers. So I want to, as a reminder, say that the extensive continuum is real, but it doesn't exist. On page 76, Whitehead explains that Descartes with Newton assumed the extensive continuum is actual in the full sense of being an actual entity, but Whitehead says he doesn't assume that the extensive continuum is actual in the sense of being an actual entity. Okay, now to help explain this, I've really only done page 61 and 62, and I haven't even done all of that. I'm going to jump ahead to page 65. Here, Whitehead says, the datum, which is the primary phase in the process constituting an actual entity, is nothing else than the actual world itself in its character of a possibility for the process of being felt. Whitehead returns to character to make his point. He needs to avoid any fundamental bifurcation, for example, between actuality and potentiality. And he does so again through the notion of character. Again, it's the character of a settled world that constitutes the datum for a new becoming. It is the characterfulness of actuality which matters. What is given as an initial datum is the reality of potentiality, not of actuality. While elements of a previous entity are not the initial actual factor in a new entity, they can be a real factor. And this is the role of the principle of relativity. Okay. So far, so good. That's all quite clear? We all like, that's our standard Whitehead reading? It's not. Anyway, but as is often the case, Whitehead takes a further step, and it's this step which is extraordinary, but necessary for the consistency of his philosophy. He continues, also, the potential objectifications of itself contribute to the real potentialities whose solidarity the continuum expresses. So, what he's saying is that it's not just what does happen, it's what could have happened and what didn't happen which contributes to the real potentialities. I'm not going to go down that route. It does make it slightly more complicated, but I thought I'd just say that there is even more to it than I might have set out. Okay, how an actual entity might or could be taken up or not by future actual entities is a real factor in existence. The future inhabits the present in the ways in which the future could unfold actually contributes to the real possibilities which inhere in the community of entities which are not yet taken up. And this is one role of the extensive continuum. Indeed, the extensive continuum is one of the ways in which the future is in the present. And this relates back to character. For Whitehead says, the reality of the future, and this is in the extensive continuum chapter, the reality of the future is bound up with the reality of this continuum. It is the reality of what is potential in its character of a real component of what is actual. Okay. The future is real without being actual. It sits on the side of potentiality. It's related to the reality of the potentiality of that which will become the past as expressed by the extensive continuum. It's never simply a question of what is possible. It's a matter of the character of potentiality. We can't assume that potentiality is a deep resource which we can all tap into. There's always a kind of potentiality, a limited potentiality. In fact, potentiality needs explaining, and it always has a character. I suppose, let me interrupt myself again. I suppose one of the things I'm trying to think about is what I said at the very beginning. It's allowing for things to exist without making them have to be actual, is what I'm trying to get at. And I think what Whitehead's trying to get at, and I think it's what Whitehead enables us within philosophy to do, to not reduce things to questions of existence. Well, is it actual? And to allow there to be a reality, and this is the reality of potentiality, and I'm not sure then what we do with that, but I think it's important to have the two. I think that's all I wanted to say so far. Sorry. Right, that was much clearer. I should have said that right at the beginning. Okay. Section 3, solidarity. I used to think that in Process and Reality, Whitehead maintained that there was an indistinct but coherent community of entities which had already become and which comprised a real potentiality which made up the extensive continuum and which offered possibilities or potentialities for new becomings and entities. And this, I thought, was the extensive continuum. And I thought that this expressed the solidarity of existence, how things held together. But it turns out this was a misunderstanding. I was conflating the community of the actual world with another term, that of solidarity, which Whitehead actually understands in a very specific way. The problem is that he doesn't really tell us how specific his reading is, except in a footnote on page 40 of Process and Reality, where he says that his meaning of the word he comes from Wilden Carr's 1917 presidential address to the Aristotelian Society. Now, Wilden Carr's main concern was the relationship between the mind and the body. Okay? So I went and read Wilden Carr's piece, and I'll read out a long quotation, and I'll tell you what. So this is Whitehead's, where he gets solidarity from. So Wilden Carr says, solidarity, was originally a term of Roman and civil law to express the character of a contract in which a single matter involved several obligations on the part of the debtors, with corresponding rights to the creditors. The term solidarity means that diverse, even divergent activities together bring to pass a single common result to which all the activities contribute without sacrificing their individual integrity. Wilden Carr, 1917, page 32. But the final sentence could have come straight from Process and Reality, and it bears repeating. The term solidarity means that diverse, even divergent activities together bring to pass a single common result to which all the activities contribute without sacrificing their individual integrity. Solidarity concerns the process through which a range of divergent factors, the many, leads to one outcome. And it's interesting, but it's about debt. I like the idea that the debt of the past owes us a debt, rather than us always thinking about us owing a debt to the future. Actually, the past owes us something. Never mind, I'm making that up on the fly. But this is one of Whitehead's major concerns throughout Process and Reality, how a novel entity can arise from a many to which it is related, but from which it is distinct. In fact, so the key point is that the primary meaning of solidarity is of one thing following many others. That's what solidarity means. It's not bonds between contemporary individuals. It's about the passing on of the world. And this, as you will have noticed, is very similar to the ideas I was discussing earlier, the question of how one thing arises from and is distinct from and yet linked to another. How can one entity be in another? And this, turns out, is the very specific point, which is one of the points of the notion of solidarity. And it's a term he uses 5 times in the chapter on the extensive continuum, precisely to explain how one entity can be in another entity. So, he says on page 56, where he makes a point clearly, he says, how can the other actual entities, each with its own formal existence, also enter objectively into the perception constitution of the actual entity in question? And this is the problem of the solidarity of the universe. So solidarity is not at one time, it's the question of the passing on from one entity to another. It's not between contemporaries, it's a matter of legacy and inheritance. We can now revisit the extensive continuum. So, I'm going to do another long quotation, but it's because it's got all the right words in it. This extensive continuum expresses the solidarity of all possible standpoints. But now we have to realize that that's not like at a point in instance. This is a solidarity of the moving forward. So these are standpoints which are sort of out of time with each other. These are the relative perspectives. It is not a fact prior to the road. Prior to the world, it is the first determination of order, of real potentiality, arising out of a general character of the world. And this is where he says, it does not involve shapes, dimensions, or measurability. These are additional determinations arising from our cosmic epoch. I've realized, I am beginning to run out of time. Thought I would. So I'm going to jump ahead. I'll give you one more quote, and then I'll push myself to say something which I think is wrong, but it might be right. Okay? The extensive continuum, Whitehead says later on in the chapter, is that general relational element in experience whereby the actual entity's experience and that unit experience itself are united in the solidarity of one common world. All right, here we go. So we've got solidarity again, but now we've got experience. And I'm back to this question of whether the extensive continuum is real or not. Now, the reality of extensive continuum arises because it's an element in experience. But remember, everything only is experience in Whitehead. There are only experiences of subjects, that's the reformed subjectivist principle and the ontological principle. So apart from that, there is just bare nothingness. So apart from the experience of subjects, there is nothing. That's part of the ontological principle. But part of the experience of subjects is the experience of the extensive continuum. So when it is experienced, it is real, but is never actual. So it seems like we're saying it's imaginary if we're thinking of it at a human level, because it's just if we say, well, whenever a human perceives, they perceive extensiveness, which is the basic enabled by the extensive continuum. But that doesn't mean we're imagining it, because all entities arise from and their perception, their reception, their experience of the world is one which incorporates extensiveness. But in doing so, they're making real something which isn't actual. And it's that difficulty of holding that and saying, so, because there's a possibility of reducing it to a solipsistic, you're just saying, oh, the extensive continuum only exists as a derivative thing when something experiences. And you go, well, yes, actually, that's true, because there are only ever experiences. And Whitehead makes that quite clear. But it's a bit scary at the same time. But that's relativity. That's the utter relativity. Because there is no absolute position of space or time from which to come from. There is only the relative perspectives, the solidarities, the passing-ons of the positions of the experiences. And so the extensive continuum is sort of always there and never there. Right, I think that's what I wanted to say. Good. And this is why the Kant bit matters so much, because Kant's only told half the story. How long have I haven't got that long left, have I? No. I have? Oh. I've done this thing, you know, do you ever do this when you're at a conference and you go back to your computer and you add things to defend yourself? So I've got a whole defense, because I'm assuming you're all going to argue, so I've just got massive chunks of quotes of Whitehead, so when you come back at me, I'll go, no, honestly, so I'm prepared. I really want to talk about eternal objects, because they're actually key, and they're actually key to character. Because I haven't explained, I realised when I was going through, I haven't explained what character is, but remember, character isn't, because that's part of what I'm getting. Character is real, but not actual, like the extensive continuum. Now, a couple of times I've celebrated how sparse, how wide-ranging the extensive continuum is. It has no shape or measurability. That's not the end of the story. Let's go back to page 62. We got up to page 66. I know it's taken quite a long time. We went from page 61 to 66 with a couple of other references. Back on page 62, when we're talking about perception, he makes it clear that his argument has only dealt with the bare mathematical properties of extensive continuum. Something additional is needed for what we think of as human perception, presentational immediacy. And he says, quite clearly, this additional content is supplied by the eternal objects termed sense data. It's one of those 2 or 3 times in Process and Reality where he seems to completely conflate eternal objects with sense data. Okay. And perhaps even colours. Now, some people don't like Whitehead's notion of eternal objects, but I've always had a soft spot for them. I love them. And when I was preparing this talk, I found what I'd missed previously, perhaps the best definition of eternal objects. Any entity whose conceptual recognition does not involve a necessary reference to any definite actualities of the temporal world is called an eternal object. So it's just, I won't go into that, but let's see. I need to get in an eternal object is simply something which can be recognized without reference to any definite empirical thing. Hence, although he never names an eternal object, but gives a lovely long quote from John Locke when he's talking about eternal objects. And remember, and he talks about, he uses John Locke to talk about whiteness, hardness, drunkenness, motion, man, elephant, as sort of quasi-examples of what could constitute an eternal object. Now, we're into this question of do eternal objects exist, but a bit like the extensive continuum, they're not actual, but they are real. So, we know that human perception is not simply perception of the world, it's perception within the world which contributes to the world. Now, the body is the vehicle of perception, is that element within the world, and it's through the witness of the body that Whitehead insists that perception is done with our eyes, with our ears, etc. Now, as I've tried to show, or tried to indicate, or to suggest, Whitehead emphasizes that settled actual entities have a character, but there's more to it than this. The way in which entities made them what they are, it contributed to their character. The way in which the world was perceived or prehended remains. The way the feeling was felt remains in the settled actual entity. It is no longer an active feeling, but it does not disappear. The manner of the feeling, no matter how negligible, cannot be eradicated. This constitutes one aspect of its character, but it raises the question of how this character is transmitted to a new entity. And the answer is, and it has been all through my talk, and I didn't tell you, it's via eternal objects. Because eternal objects act as the fulcrum between an object which was once a subject and felt in a certain way, and a nascent subject which then feels those feelings in a certain way. So eternal objects are the means by which the character of what is now an object is transported into a new subject. Yep, the manner is the character of the world which is transported by it. So, does he really say this? Well, yeah. The eternal objects function by introducing the multiplicity of actual entities as constitutive of the actual entity in question. Okay? But eternal objects may well be abstract, but they're always tied up with the operation of the body. He says he makes the body the starting point for our knowledge of the circumambient world. So he says that qualities such as colors, sounds, bodily feelings, tastes, smells, together, this is the important bit, together with the perspectives introduced by extensive relationships, are the relational eternal objects, whereby the contemporary actual entities are elements in our constitution. So we're back with the question of how can one entity be in another entity, and it's through the character of the world which is comported and transported by eternal objects. Right. But those eternal objects are comported by the body. So this is my reading, and this is why at a previous talk I said, where's the body? It's at the point where it are most abstract. Whitehead's talking about eternal objects, and we think he's talking about pure potentiality, etc. He's actually talking about, at the same time, about, for us humans at least, of the sense data which is given to us via the body. There is, to my mind, an extraordinarily close relationship between the body and eternal objects. Because we perceive colours with our eyes. That's the point of the withness of the body. It's not simply an argument against, the supposed Descartes split, a mind-body split. It's more of an account of the multiplicity of existence in relationship to Einstein, if that makes sense. It's about how the world, the universe, whatever the universe is, the worlds, carry through us. No, I am right. I'll stop. When you do the film, can you edit that bit out, please? No, of course. Well, you can, but you won't. Okay. Maybe I'll talk about that again. Colours objectify the perceived entity in one way and our perception of them in another. So, the object felt itself as red, and we feel itself as red, but the redness is felt through our eyes, through our body. So the body is absolutely related to the possibility of the carrying on of the operation of eternal objects. I wrote it all down. I should have, instead of just doing one of my talk bits, I should have read it out. Never mind. Okay. Thus, these sense data are eternal objects playing a complex relational role. They connect the actual entities of the past with the actual entities of the contemporary world, and thereby affect objectifications of the contemporary things and of past things. Character of the world is conveyed via eternal objects, insofar as they express potentiality. The chair is red, but it could have been green. It is eternal objects which link the past and the present and the future. It is eternal objects which enable the solidarity of the world through the transportation of character. Right. Final section, transmutation. The problem, which Whitehead is trying to explain, as we've sort of seen, is how the character of the past moves or is taken up by a future entity. We've seen that not all of the past can be taken up. We don't often talk, I don't often think about the category of transmutation, but it's right there at the start of Process and Reality, just after the category of conceptual reversion. Transmutation is about vaguely perceiving. It is about perception which arises from actual entities or actual occasions, but in which we do not see actual entities. Absolutely brilliant. I know that within the Whitehead community there is a bit of a split between those who say Actual entities, actual occasions, eternal objects, completely metaphysical. We never encounter them, we never see them. We can't really, we can think about them, but we shouldn't talk about them as constituting the world. That's a speculative ban promoted by Mark Hansen. I'm sort of on that side, that we need to be careful. We can't talk about prehensions, actual occasions, eternal objects. They are really sort of metaphysical, okay? And actually, this is what the category of transmutation does. Transmutation involves disregarding the range of elements which make up the world or environment considered as the ontological principle, as considered as made up of actual occasions. We don't perceive actual entities or actual occasions in their raw state. We do not perceive all existence. Instead, we make a selection. We reduce the multitude of actual entities to one datum, as I've talked about. Now, eternal objects play a key role in this, and it's in the chapter on the extensive continuum that the first time that Whitehead talks about the category of transmutation. He sets it up as a category at the beginning, then doesn't talk about it, and it's only in this chapter, when he says, it's the question of this perception of a nexus vaguely, that is to say, without the distinction of actual entities composing it, discussed in terms of the theory of prehensions. So that's exactly what I'm saying. This is exactly the question of perception vaguely. But this isn't just humans that perceive vaguely. Then I suddenly realized, do you remember when we went back and we said some datum, there's some real component? All existence is perception vaguely. All entities which don't take the whole world, all entities take some aspect of the world. And that's part of the choosing. You know, when we've been talking about decisions and things, but I haven't gone to that side of things. I've just started with the initial datum. And what it is the character of the world, which is the initial datum, because that's part of... Oh, no, right, I'll stop. Apart from transmutation, our feeble intellectual operations would fail to penetrate into the dominant characteristic of things. We can only understand by discarding. And transmutation, this is Whitehead, is the way in which the actual world is felt as a community and is felt in virtue of its prevalent order. Transmutation, but provides the sense of community, not solidarity, but it's only a sense of community, because we can't know the community of actual occasions, and we can't experience them in and of themselves as actual occasions. And that's why he has the whole notion of transmutation. We focus on the concepts, the categories of conceptual reversion and valuation, but we shouldn't. They're metaphysical. If we want to talk about human-level perception, we should be talking about the category of transmutation. Okay. It's 5 to 10. I am, for those of you who've seen me before, you'll realize this is how I talk. So I do tend to interrupt myself and then go back and things like that. So I always knew, but then I always feel slightly disappointed at the end. But I don't have a clever ending, I've now realized, because I've come at the ending one way. But I'm beginning to go round in circles, and so I will stop.